Let's talk about the Tanakh. So why is it called the Tanakh? We're going to start with a couple of slides to start with tonight. This is the Hebrew Bible. This is what we would call the Old Testament, but it's not quite exactly what we have as our Old Testament, and we're going to talk about this. The word Tanakh comes from three letters. In fact, most of Hebrew is written in a three-letter form, and so their actual name for their Bible is the same way. You have a T for the Tanakh, you have an N, which is in the middle, and then you have K. Okay, T and N and K, and they just put the vowels in between to become the word Tanakh, and that's the Hebrew spelling for it up there. But so you have T, which stands for Torah, and of course that means teaching or instruction. Then you have the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and then you have the Ketubim, which is the writings. And it's broken into three sections, and they call it as a group the Tanakh. So it specifies not just the books of the Bible, but how they consider the breakdown of this. So and this is going to be important to look at tonight. We're going to kind of really explore why do they break it down this way. But I just want to kind of compare some of the things that are maybe a little different or maybe out of the ordinary from the way our Old Testament works. First of all, we have the Torah. Okay, this is the law. We know what that is. We've talked about this. These are the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. First 5 books of our Old Testament, first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as well. And so this is exactly the same for all intents and purposes. Then they have a second section. And their second section of their Old Testament, or their Hebrew Bible, consists of 8 books. It's called the Nevi'im, or the prophets. When you think about it, these are all of what they would consider prophets in the Old Testament. There are only 8 books here. In fact, all of the Hebrew Bible only has 24 books. Who knows how many books our Old Testament has? 39, that's right. So does that mean that we added more stuff? No. It actually means that they call maybe one book what we would call 2 books. And here are some examples of it. You'll notice here in Samuel, they have the book of Samuel. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's just simply, they put them both into one book and call it the book of Samuel. The book of Kings, we have 1st and 2nd Kings. They just have Kings. We have, Judges and Joshua. They're all the same. A lot of these other books are very similar. But it's interesting to note what they put in with their what they consider prophetic books. We might recognize, Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, we would know they're prophets, right, from the Old Testament. And we may not always think of the book of Joshua as a prophetic book, but they considered Joshua a prophet that followed Moses. The Judges, why would the Judges be a prophetic book? Well, think about all these particular ones in the book of Judges that were God's spoken prophet in that time. The Judges were considered prophets, so they looked at it that way. Samuel, of course, was a prophet, and even the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, they consider prophetic. And it's important to them because they look at Kings. Sometimes we say, Chronicles and Kings are kind of the same book, right? It's kind of like if you've ever read through the Bible, it's like they just repeated everything in Chronicles that they already said in Kings. And the Jews see it very differently, and I think we should as well. We can learn something from them in this regard because Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, records how the prophets played an important and key role in Israel's history. And the Jewish tradition says that Joshua wrote the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, and of course Joshua was considered a prophet as well. And so we have the prophets. The other interesting thing is that they group in one book what they call the Book of the 12. The Book of the 12 is literally 12 of our minor prophets all grouped into one book. So everything from Hosea to Malachi to Zephaniah to Zechariah, all of the minor prophets that we have grouped there towards the end of our Old Testament, they have one book, and they call the Book of the 12. It's 12 of the minor prophets altogether. And then we have the K in the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketubim, and this is just a word for writings. These are just like This is everything else. This is the other types of writings that are available. So we have, of course, Psalms. We have poetry and things like that. We have Proverbs. We have wisdom literature. We have Job grouped in here, Ruth, Song of Psalms, Ecclesiastes. Different types of books are here. 11 books are included here in the writings. And I think it's interesting, a couple of interesting notes here in what they consider the writings. You notice down here, one what we might consider a very important prophet is Daniel. They didn't put Daniel up with the prophets. You ever think about why that might be? Why might Daniel not be included in the prophets? It may not be as clear as you might think, because they recognize that Daniel recorded prophecy. He certainly interpreted dreams. He was certainly a man of God, and there's no dissing Daniel in this point. But if you were to read the book of Daniel and compare it to all of the other prophetic books, there is no direct communication with God with Daniel. Daniel receives his vision of prophecy through dreams or from visions or from other types of things that he gets to see. But it's never, God told Daniel to write these words as the prophet. And so therefore they consider Daniel part of the writings for that reason. It was always God's Spirit or the dreams that he was given that caused him to write his book. The other thing I think that's interesting here is how they have these grouped together. It's just an interesting point. We don't have time to get through all of this. There's a lot of very interesting things about how the order of the books has some significance here. But here's just an interesting one. It goes, and this is the order of their books: Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth. Okay, a little bit different than the Old Testament. But think about the last of the Proverbs. Anybody know Proverbs 31? You don't have to quote it for me, but what's it about? Anybody know Proverbs 31? Yeah, that's right. The perfect woman, the virtuous woman. Who can find her? Her price is far above rubies, right? And it goes on and on about all the things that the virtuous woman does. And then the very next book introduces Ruth, the virtuous woman, the one who's hardworking, the one whose heart is pure, the one who wants to follow the Lord, the one who ultimately is rewarded of the Lord. And so there's a tie-in between, from their perspective, between this virtuous woman, and here she is described to us in the book of Ruth. Ruth is their picture of that. This Moabite woman who proves to be a virtuous woman by binding herself to those promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think that's just one of the very simple illustrations that shows how they've had some intention that we've maybe lost in our Old Testament because of how they've strung these books together. The other book that is interesting here, of course, Chronicles. They have one book for that. We have two. Chronicles, you notice they put Kings in with the prophets, but the Chronicles they put down here, and it actually closes the Hebrew Bible, the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The reason it is not prophetic, remember we said they believe that Kings was written by Joshua the prophet. They believe that Chronicles was written by Ezra, and Ezra was a priest, right? He wasn't a prophet. Because of that, while it's similar to Kings, it also has different themes. The book of Chronicles has themes about the restoration of the kingdom, about the Davidic line, and it points forward to a coming Messiah more than the book of 1st and 2nd Kings does. So all of these things together, this represents the Hebrew Bible, called the Tanakh, and about the fact that by the time of the first generation of the Second Temple period, this is talking about Ezra's time. During the time when they were rebuilding the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah, this was the time when the Bible of the Old Testament got finally pulled together. And this was about 300, 400 years before the birth of Christ that the Old Testament was finally completely assembled in one. Interestingly enough, you say, well, how did it come from there to here? Well, of course, by the time Jesus came along, by the time the first century came along, we talked about this last time, that they had translated it into Greek. That's known as the Septuagint. And we do have some existing copies of that, but we don't have copies of the Septuagint that go back to Jesus' day. In fact, the oldest copies up until not that long ago, The oldest copies that we have of the Old Testament are from about 800 to 1000 A.D., so about almost 800 years or 1,000 years after Christ. There was a group of Jewish scribes that lived through that era. They were known as the Masoretes, and we have what's known as the Masoretic text, which is what they transcribed. The Jews were very meticulous, and still are today, by the way, when they write out a scroll and when they transcribe God's Word, because if there's even one mistake, they trash the whole thing and they start it over. And this was how important God's Word was to them. And so it's interesting to say, until the 1940s, late 1940s, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, you probably heard of that story there in Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and basically we found entire copies of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that dated to probably 100 years before the time of Christ. And we found them in these scrolls. Interestingly enough, when we pulled those out and we compared them to the things that were transcribed that were 1,000 years newer, they were identical. There was no changes. Over 1,000 years of recopying through the scribes. And that's really a tribute to the fact that God's Word, God's preserving His Word. And we don't always understand it or, maybe have confidence in that, but that has been a very interesting thing. If you go to Israel, you go to Jerusalem today, you can see the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have one Isaiah scroll that they found in the Dead Sea, find there. And it's the whole book of Isaiah. They have a giant room, and the whole way around the room is the scroll that's unrolled. And so you can go in and you can literally, it's like back in the day, there used to be the cyclorama at Gettysburg. Remember that? Some of you may say that. Is that still around, by the way? I'm not sure if it even is there anymore. But it used to be you could go there and see in a big circle the whole Gettysburg battlefield. Well, this is the idea, but they do it with an Isaiah scroll, and you can see the entire book of Isaiah as they found it. So anyway, the book has been preserved for us, and we have confidence in it. So let's ask a couple of questions about not only the fact that this is what it's about and this is what the Jews believed, but obviously we've talked about there's some same things about it, but there's also some differences. The main difference in terms of our Old Testament and what the Hebrew Bible is really an issue of organization. There's no like, well, we didn't include this and they include that. There's none of that going on. Our Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible have the same exact things in it. It's just that we have reorganized things, as we've talked about, for the sake of the way our Old Testament is presented. But I want us to take a look at how the Tanakh is put together, because I think there's some interesting points of application that we should get from this that we miss in the way our Old Testament is arranged. And that's why I wanted to spend this time tonight to talk about how the Tanakh is arranged. And as I said, there's 3 sections: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And each of these, if you think about where these lie, you have Deuteronomy. Joshua follows Deuteronomy. That's just exactly the way our Bible is set up. But you get to the end of this second section, they end their second section with the book of Malachi. Where does Malachi end our Old Testament? At the end of our Old Testament, right? The very end. And then right following Malachi is the book of Psalms. That starts their writings. And at the end of the Ketuvim, which we don't show here, is the book of Chronicles. Chronicles ends their Old Testament, or ends the Hebrew Bible. So these are what they call seams. If you think about it, you have 3 sections, and you have this seam between each section. I think there's some interesting applications here that I want us to pull out from tonight, because it's something, as I said, we don't always get to see. So we see the Torah ends with Deuteronomy. You can turn around here with me, Deuteronomy chapter 34. Okay, we see in Deuteronomy 34 the end of Moses. Moses is buried here. And verses 10 to 12, the last few verses of Deuteronomy, it says, "There arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And then verse 11, in all the signs and the wonders which the Lord had sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all of his servants, and to all his land, and in all that mighty hand, and in all the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel. Just a few chapters before, in Deuteronomy 18, there's a prediction that there will be a prophet that's going to arise. He is going to be greater than Moses. He is going to do these great things. He's going to do something greater than Moses ever did. And you get to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the end of the Torah, and there's no knowledge of this prophet. It's written from sometime in the future perspective after the other prophets have already come and gone. These verses are put in here to say, hey, Moses predicted there would be a prophet, somebody bigger than him. That person has never come. Interestingly enough, then you turn over to Joshua chapter 1. You begin the book of the prophets, and it says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister. Now we remember what Joshua did. Joshua took the people from the desert place, from their place of wandering, and he brought them in and conquered the land of Canaan. He brought them to the promised land. And it would be very easy to think, this is the guy. This is the guy that Moses was prophesying about, the guy that was going to do what Moses couldn't. But what does he say in verse 2? Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that I have given unto you, as I said unto Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, unto the great sea, toward the going down of the sun shall be your coast. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. This is sounding like, boy, Joshua's the guy. Then what does it say? Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou may observe to do according to all the law, which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. Thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein, for then shalt thou make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. And so we see the book of Joshua being brought out here with this. Here's a new prophet. He's going to bring in the people to the land, but he's still subject to the law that we just got through, the Torah, and we also have already been given the information he wasn't anything as good as Moses. Not even Joshua was. This is the connection that's being made between these two sections. He is not the promised Messiah. And he's reminded that he's going to have to rely on God's promises just like his predecessor did. And he's going to have to keep the law of Moses. So then we go to the next section. Go to the end of this Nevi'im. Go to Malachi. Okay, interestingly enough, it's at the end of our Old Testament, but Malachi chapter 4. You're going to see some parallels between what we just read, between that last seam and this one. Malachi chapter 4. I know it's where the pages stick together. Right between the Old and the New Testament. Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 to 6. Here's Malachi the prophet, and he's closing his oracle here. And speaking to the people, he says, remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Boy, this sounds just a lot like what he just said to Joshua, what he just said at the end of Deuteronomy. He says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Okay, so here we see, again, pointing back to the law, pointing back to what needed to happen in terms of keeping the law, but also now a prophecy that points forward to Elijah's return. Now, we know course, you turn the page and we think, well, it's not too long in the book of the Gospels here that we see John the Baptist coming on the scene, right? And we know that he came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, but we also know that he wasn't that Elijah. The Elijah that is predicted here in the book of Malachi comes before that great and dreadful day of the Lord. Was Jesus coming a great and dreadful day of the Lord? No. It was a day of rejoicing. He came to redeem his people. He came for salvation, the coming of Christ. Now, when Christ comes again, there's going to be a great and dreadful day, right? Because it's going to be a day of judgment. So most scholars would say Malachi's prophecy points forward to the second coming of Christ, to the time probably in the tribulation. Revelation talks to us about two witnesses that will be there during the tribulation, and this may be when Elijah comes back and this prophecy in Malachi gets fulfilled. But this makes sense for us. Why, when John the Baptist came, did the Jews ask if he was Elijah? Well, it's because of Malachi. They wanted to know if this was the guy that was going to usher in that great and dreadful day of the Lord. And just like in the ending of the Torah, what's Malachi pointing towards? A day when the prophet's going to come that's going to be greater than Moses. He says he's coming, and Elijah's going to show him the way. Now, he's pointing to the second coming, but nonetheless, he's talking about this day. And there's a lot of confusion in the Jewish reading of this, to understand that there were two comings. There was going to be a first coming and a second coming of Christ. So we leave this, okay? Again, the theme between all of these themes in the Tanakh all comes down to pointing to this Messiah. It's all pointing to the fact the law has to be kept. There has to be someone come that's going to be better than Moses, and he's going to come at some point in the future. Go to Psalm chapter 1. This is the beginning of the third section of the Tanakh. And Psalm chapter 1 begins with, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is the law of the Lord. And in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season, his leaf shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper." Now, we like to try to make all of these psalms personal to us, and I think there's a personal application here. But Psalm chapter 1, clearly speaking of the man, the particular one, who is the blessed man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. None of us ever have. There's only one. It's Jesus. It points to the Messiah. It's a messianic psalm, the one that never stood in the way of sinners, nor sits with the scornful. He delights in the law of the Lord. He's like the tree planted by the rivers of water. This points to the Messiah. In fact, many of the psalms do. But again, this points to who? The Messiah, the prophet that's going to be greater than Moses. And in every one of these themes, there's a pointing to the law has to be fulfilled, the Messiah has to come, and ultimately he's got to be bigger and better than Moses ever was. It's the similar theme, and you see this in every one of these, that there's a Messiah which is to come. You say that the Jewish people, you think about this when Jesus came, and he begins to quote all of these Old Testament scriptures that we're not as accurate with as they knew back in that day. Their whole Bible was centered and stitched up with this theme of pointing to a Messiah which was to come, pointing to what he would do, pointing to how he would act, and ultimately the justification that was going to happen through all the world, the judgment and power that he was going to show when he came, that was going to be greater than Moses. To the Jewish people, even to this day, there's no prophet greater than Moses, right? What does even the Bible say? He stood face to face with God. He took the commandments, right? He parted the Red Sea. He had all the plagues. Do you ever see any other prophet do those kind of things? He brought God's people out from bondage, from a superpower of the world. This was To them, Moses is the prophet. And to think that there's going to be a prophet greater than Moses, it indicates to us that, boy, this is going to be something much bigger. And this was the Messiah that they were looking for. Now, here's the interesting thing. We go to 2 Chronicles, okay? This is the end of their Hebrew Bible. I'm going to kind of jump around here because it's not the end of ours. But if you go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, this is how their Bible ends. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 and 23. The people were in captivity, and here we have at the end of this captivity, it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord, spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, might be accomplished. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. You see, this was the beginning of the Second Temple period. This was the time after they had been in captivity for these 70 years. Jeremiah had prophesied that they would only be captive for a certain period of time. And then, of course, we know Ezra comes up. We know Nehemiah comes up. They begin to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple. And the temple that gets built there, with some modifications over time, this was the temple that was there when Jesus was there in the first century for the next several hundred years. And the end of their Hebrew Bible basically says, hey, there's a temple going to be built, and you all can go back home. Now, they were still, of course, oppressed. They never had their own country again. But it points to the fact that the people are going to be regathered. The nation was going to be a nation again, even though it was under bondage. And these prophecies that were contained all through the Old Testament could now be fulfilled. They couldn't be fulfilled while they were in bondage, while they were in captivity. And so this points to that. The end of their Hebrew Bible really is it's looking forward. It's saying, there's a time when this nation's going to gather. We're going to be able to go up. We now have the edict from the king. And these are important endings, because what does it tell us that the Jews should have been looking for this Messiah to come? So our Old Testament books, we retain those same connections between Deuteronomy and Joshua, which is good. But sometimes we miss the fact because we place Malachi at the end, and there's a reason for that, by the way. Malachi was the last book written chronologically, and it also points to John the Baptist, as we've just talked about, or what they thought might be. And I think there was some reasoning for that, but this is something we sometimes miss. The Old Testament clearly speaks of Jesus Christ coming, and it doesn't just speak of it in terms of the very words that we share, the verses that we memorize. Even the way the Hebrew scribes put it together, the way they connected all these scriptures, the way they put the books in particular order, shows that they knew about this Messiah, that he was to come. And when the Jesus Christ came and showed from the scriptures who he was, demonstrated through his power the miracles, demonstrated the fulfillment of all of these prophecies, it should have been clear as day, because their Hebrew Bible had been pointing to him all along. And what does the Bible say? They had hard hearts. He came to his own, and his own received him not. They didn't want to hear it. The Hebrew Bible that they had been reading for hundreds of years pointed to him in every possible way. And yet, they just didn't want to hear it when the time came. I think this is an interesting thought that kind of wraps all this together. What is the theme of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Tanakh? It's the hope of Israel and of the world. A Messiah who can meet God's righteous requirements and stand as man's representative before him, and thereby offer full and final deliverance from every enemy of mankind for all who trust in him. This is the prophet, like Moses, who was promised to come in Deuteronomy 18, but who in Israel's history had not yet come. They acknowledge that. This is the one who would lead Israel into her final rest, much like Joshua, but into a greater promised land. He was to tread upon the wicked by trusting courageously in God's word, just like Joshua and Malachi predicted. This is the one who is blessed as God designed man to be and bearing fruit to God's glory, as we saw in Psalm 1 and also Malachi 4. This is the one who was to judge the wicked. Again, Psalm 1, Malachi 3 and 4. After he makes many of them righteous himself. This is the son of David, the son of Abraham, the son of Adam, the son of God, as we saw at the beginning. What ties the various strands of the canon together into coherent unity is the eschatological hope, that's the future hope, of Israel coming through her Messiah. And that hope is still there today for all who will trust in him. And so, it's sad in one way that you see so many Jewish people who are tied into their Jewish scriptures and their traditions and the things that you even saw in the video tonight and not recognize that their Messiah has come. The Messiah that their whole Bible has pointed to, they've missed. We have a great opportunity. Sometimes it's still going to be a hard one, but if you see and meet with Jewish people, there is so much wealth in their Bible that points to the Messiah. And there's so much wealth for us as well, because you realize that all of those 39 books that we have in our Old Testament, they point to the Messiah that we know as Jesus Christ. So if you want to know Jesus, know your Old Testament. Know the Tanakh, because it all points to him.